In today's video, we're going to talk about the Starlink Mini and how it compares to the Gen 2 and Gen 3 dishes that are available for the Roam plan. What's up everybody, my name is Dan, welcome to Freely Roaming. So I am here in southern Chile and I'm actually on the island of Chiloé, which is part of the Patagonia region in the Los Lagos, northern part. We are starting to make our way south into the rest of Patagonia until we get to the bottom of the continent. What's been really exciting for me is that for the last month or so, I've been able to use the Starlink Mini on this trip that we're on. We've been using the Starlink Gen 2 for a couple of years now. However, when we got to Argentina, the Starlink Mini became available for sale in Argentina, so we were able to purchase with an Argentinian plan. And for about the last month, I've been able to use it, so I can finally give you guys some comparisons as to how it works, how it compares to Gen 2. And here on the island of Chiloé in Chile, we've been staying at an Airbnb for about a week, and they actually have one of these Gen 3 dishes that I've been using. So I can actually compare the Mini to both the Gen 2 and the Gen 3 in this video for you. First of all, today's Black Friday. What's been really exciting for me being in South America is that many Latin American countries have the Starlink Mini dish deeply discounted compared to the US. I was able to get mine for $250 in Argentina after the conversion rate. And other countries like Guatemala, El Salvador, Panama, and Colombia, they've had it for $199. And those prices have been slashed again. Now in Panama and Colombia, you can actually buy the Starlink Mini dish for $160. The dish that I paid in Argentina for $250 is now discounted to $210. A lot of you have been asking about whether or not the Starlink Mini dish will be available in the US for a lower price than $599, and that's happening now as well. Until December 8th of 2025, you can now buy the Starlink Mini in the US for $449. That's $150 off the $599 price, but it's still more than double what they're selling for elsewhere. But if you're in the US and you've been waiting for one, right now is the time to get it. I'll put a link in the description below for you guys to go check it out and pick one up if you don't have a Starlink Mini already. You don't have to be a new customer. You can be an old customer and just upgrade your dish by adding a new dish to your account and then putting the other dish either on pause or just disabling it altogether. So first of all, let me show you the Starlink Mini and what it comes with. It comes in a very small box like this. In fact, it is about the size of the box that a MacBook Pro comes in when you order it from Apple. Inside the box, you have the dish itself over here, which is super small. It's about the size of a laptop computer, if you haven't seen one already. Underneath, it comes with a super long 50-foot cable. The actual cable is much thinner than the one that comes with the Gen 2 and definitely thinner than the one that comes with the Gen 3. Because there's no power over Ethernet happening here. This is just supplying power. And the router itself is integrated into the dish. It comes with what's called a kickstand in the back, which comes out, a little tab, and then pull it backwards. It pops out like that, and then pops in also the exact same way. There's also a separate piece that you can use that lets you connect it to a pole mount. This one's a little bit more secure because it's got a metal insert in the ring here and a way to tighten it to the pole. And then lastly, the power supply. Just comes with an AC power supply. I have the Argentinian version here with these angled conductors. And this power supply is actually just a simple AC to DC converter. It converts 110 or 240 AC to 30 volt DC at 2 amps, which means this is a 60 watt power supply, 60 watt DC power supply at 30 volts. Now let me give you some spec comparison. I'll be comparing today the Starlink Mini against the Gen 2 dish, which is the actuated one that we've been using for the past couple of years, and also the Gen 3 dish, which like the Mini is just a scaled up version of that, and that is the dish that is the default dish that people will get when you order Starlink in the US. There is actually a fourth dish that you can get, which is the high performance dish that's been around for a little while now, and it looks like that is currently just available if you purchase the boat plans. So we won't be comparing that one in this video. So let's talk about the Gen 2. The Gen 2 actuated dish. The dish itself is 20.2 inches by 11.9 inches, giving you a 240 square inch surface area for the dish. The Mini, however, is 11.75 by 10.20, which is almost exactly half their surface area on the dish's surface at 119.85 inch squared. The Gen 3 is much bigger. The Gen 3 is about 3 times the size in square inches when it comes to the dish area as compared to the Mini. 23.4 by 15.07, giving you 352.64 inch squared. The Mini and the Gen 3 are both non-actuated dishes, means that there's no moving parts, versus the Gen 2 traditional one that a lot of people have still, is one with the tilt motor and the rotational motor. And that one I believe is actually no longer sold in the US. The Gen 2 original one weighs in at 6.4 pounds, while the Mini is less than half of the weight at 2.56 pounds. And that's including the plastic kickstand. The Gen 3, on the other hand, is 7 pounds, including the kickstand. All three dishes have the same field of view at 110 degrees as it scans the sky. All three routers and all three dishes use the same WPA2 security protocol. The difference in the routers is in the Wi-Fi technology. In the Gen 2 actuated dish and the Starlink Mini, these are Wi-Fi 5 routers versus the Gen 3 dish uses Wi-Fi 6. And the main differences between those two is speed, the number of devices that can be connected to it, as well as range. The Gen 2 and the Mini uses a dual band 3x3 MIMO radio versus the Gen 3 uses a tri-band 4x4 MIMO radio. MIMO stands for multiple in, multiple out. They all have the same operating temperature. That means all three dishes can be operational within a temperature range of -30 Celsius or -22 Fahrenheit up to 50 Celsius, which is 122 Fahrenheit. The IP ratings are a little bit different. The Gen 2 has an IP54 rating, while the Mini has an IP67 rating, and the Gen 3 dish has an IP56 rating. So the Starlink Mini is actually the most water and weatherproof unit of all three. The biggest difference here is in the power consumption. And the main reason why I switched to the Starlink Mini is because of the power consumption as well. In my time using the Starlink Mini dish, I have measured that it uses almost exactly half the amount of power that the Gen 2 dishes uses. It averages about 24 watts over a 24-hour period, means that it uses about 570 watt hours, versus my Gen 2 dish used to use over a kilowatt hours over that same time frame. In this last week, since I've been here using the Gen 3 dish, the Gen 3 dish claims to use anywhere between 50 to 100 watts of power, but my experience is that it actually doesn't seem to use that much more power than the Gen 2 dish. Officially, the Gen 2 dish uses between 50 to 75 watts, the Mini uses between 25 to 40 watts, while the Gen 3 uses between 50 to 100 watts. Without having a ton of time on the Gen 3 dish, I would say the Gen 3 dish probably used 10 to 15% more power than the Gen 2. The high end of that power consumption has to do with the snow melt capability. In my use case, I always have the snow melt turned off, which is why it doesn't use nearly that much power on the high end. The Gen 2 and Gen 3 dish have melting capability of 40 millimeters of snow per hour, while the Mini has a melting capability of 25 millimeters per hour. The Wi-Fi coverage for the router is another big difference here. The Gen 2 dish can cover an area about 2,000 square feet or 185 square meter area, versus the Mini can only cover 112 meters square or 1,200 square feet. And the Gen 3, as you would imagine, has the best of them all, and it can cover up to 3,200 square feet or 297 square meter area. The secondary reason why I'm switching to the Starlink Mini and why a lot of people are doing it as well is how easy it is to convert to 12 volt DC. I have a video about how to convert the Gen 2, and it's a real popular video that a lot of people have watched. It is very challenging and quite a time-consuming process to convert a Gen 2 actuated dish to both flat mount and power off of DC. And a lot of the times, these processes are not reliable based on the components you're using, the DC power that's supplying your Gen 2 dish. You can get cutouts, you can get reboots, you can get a lot of different things that cause your dish to not perform properly. Their Starlink Mini, on the other hand, doesn't have any power over Ethernet features, so that makes converting to DC very easily. And it already runs natively off of DC, so it's actually just a matter of switching out the power supply. The mini dish has a operating voltage range between 12 to 48 volts, so you can actually supply a wide range of DC power to the mini to get it to work. From the factory, it supplies 30 volts, and because it expects to be voltage drop over that 50-foot cable, because it's a relatively thin gauge cable, having 30 volt input means that even with a lot of voltage drop at the end of that wire, you're still supplying well over 12 volts of power. Some people have had success just supplying directly vehicle 12 volt to your Starlink Mini. But if you have any current spikes, if you have other devices connected to it that's drawing a lot of power, you can have voltage sag in that 12 volt battery. If it sags below 12 volts, the drop in power is going to cause the Starlink Mini to reboot, which is a major nuisance. Which is why even though you can supply just 12 volt power to it, it is much better to give it a higher voltage than the lowest possible that you can use with the Starlink Mini. And the other cool thing is that you can also power the Starlink Mini off of a USB-C plug. But not just any USB-C plug. This has to be a USB-C plug. By Starlink's documentation, they suggest that you use a PD 100 watt power source from USB-C. And the reason why they say that is not because it uses 100 watts of power. That's because PD100 supplies 5 amps of power at 20 volts. It's because that when you start with 20 volts, when it gets to the end of that 50-foot cable, there's still plenty of voltage to supply the power to the Starlink Mini dish. There are some PD60 that people have been using and having success with it. That's mostly because some of these PD60 power supplies are actually supplying 20 volts at 3 amps versus supplying 15 at 4 amps or 12 at 5 amps. So if you have a PD60 USB-C power supply that's supplying 20 volts at 3 amps, then it would still work because the dish doesn't consume more than 60 watts. And as long as you're starting with 20 volts of power or higher, you won't have any problems with dropout. PD stands for power delivery. So there are new power delivery standards that supply anywhere from 28 all the way up to 48 volts of power. If you have one of these power delivery USB-C devices, those all should work perfectly well as well. And what's really cool is that this week, Starlink officially came out with their own cigarette lighter plug that supplies USB-C power delivery that comes with their own USB-C cable. It's a little bit pricey, but because it comes with the cigarette lighter plug as well as the USB-C cable, it's actually a pretty good deal. Personally, I've been using just a simple 12 volt to 24 volt boost converter in the vehicle. So in the van, we have power going into a boost converter, and boost converter comes out with 24 volts, supplies up to 72 watts, which is plenty of power. And that's just been wired directly to my Starlink cable that's been running our Starlink Mini dish, flat mounted on the roof with no problems at all. And that's probably the cheapest way to do it because you already have the cable that comes with the dish. You can simply buy a female 5522 barrel plug the end of your factory cable into that, and then wire that to your 12 to 24 volt boost converter, and it works perfectly fine. There are a bunch of mounting options for the Starlink Mini. Unfortunately, here in South America, we don't have any of those options available, but in the US, you can buy different mounts that people have made that's sold on either Amazon or directly from their own websites. I'll put some links to them in the description below so you can go check them out. They can be a little bit pricey. However, the kickstand that comes with the dish itself has a couple of holes so you can run bolts through to flat mount. The only thing that I worry about is that the kickstand is not the strongest mounting option that I've seen. And I worry about pieces of the plastic tabs breaking, causing the dish to fall off the roof and go flying down the road when you're driving. So if you were to enforce it with some brackets that hold the dish down as a secondary security measure, it should work fine as well. That's in fact how I've been mounting it to my roof. I have the kickstand mounted to our roof rack and then just have a couple of metal brackets holding down the ends of it to make sure that it doesn't fly away. One of the things to note about power consumption is that you can put these dishes in sleep mode. So you can set it up as a schedule within the app to have it power off during certain hours of the day. But what I notice is that the Starlink Mini consumes 24 watts on the average when it's on. And when it's asleep, it still consumes 12 watts. So that's only a 50% power reduction. So if you want to save the most power that you can, it is still best to just unplug the entire dish when you're sleeping, so it doesn't consume any power at all. Questions have been asked about the non-tilting dishes, meaning the Starlink Mini and the Gen 3. Because there's no motorized actuation happening within the dish itself, the Starlink app asks you to tilt and rotate manually to get the dish to point in a certain way. Now, do you really have to do that? The short answer is no, you actually don't. And the reason why they make you do it, at least this is my suspicion, is actually about load balancing Starlink satellite loads. Because they have a fixed number of satellites up in the sky, as they fly around the Earth, they are only able to output a certain amount of maximum data. So based on the amount of people that are using the Starlink dishes, the Starlink satellites at any given area, by telling users to point and tilt their dishes in a certain way, they're able to load balance their actual capacity. So that's why I believe that they ask you to tilt and rotate your manual dishes, but even if you don't do it, it will still work. So there is no actual space in the sky where you have to actually point it to. As long as there are no obstructions, you should be able to get a connection pointing pretty much in any direction. Okay, so I've done some speed tests. I've done both the Gen 2 dish and the Starlink Mini dish in motion as well as sitting still. And honestly, between the Starlink Mini and the Gen 2 dish, the speeds vary so much, especially when you're on the roam plan, which means that you're deprioritized compared to a residential plan. I'm getting anywhere from 50 megabits all the way up to 200 megabits on both dishes. I'm sure in the exact same condition, the Gen 2 dish is going to perform better because the antenna array is bigger. But for practical purposes, I think the mini dish, for everything that we do, which is fairly intensive, we're not doing real serious gaming. The kids do play games on it. But for things like video chats, school, work, video streaming, any of the other stuff, the Starlink Mini is more than adequate. So we've actually have since disconnected our Gen 2 flat mount dish on the roof of our van and have been exclusively using the mini dish down here. And we're not really noticing any significant changes in our speed and performance. The Gen 3 dish, on the other hand, that we're using here at this Airbnb, now this is screaming fast. Some of my speed tests have shown speeds faster than 400 megabits per second download, which is about twice the fastest speeds I've ever seen in the Gen 2 or the mini dish. Obviously, it's a bigger dish. It's 3 times as big as the Mini, but there are also other reasons why that might be the case, because I think what they have here at this Airbnb that we're using is they're on a residential plan, which means that their speeds are prioritized and their speeds are guaranteed. So it makes sense that it's going to be the fastest possible speed for this dish. And if I was using the Starlink Mini or the Starlink Gen 2 dish, I could have guaranteed faster speeds as well, but I've never had a residential plan on either of those dishes, so I can't really tell. So between the combination of a better piece of hardware, or I should say a larger antenna array, as well as the prioritization of the plan, the Gen 3 dish is the fastest Starlink dish I've ever seen. And of course, I've never used a high performance dish, so I can't really compare this against that. But 400 megabits per second, those are speeds that are approaching some fiber optic speeds, which is amazing because we're connecting wirelessly from the surface of the Earth to a satellite dish hundreds of miles up in the sky. So let's talk about Wi-Fi 5 and Wi-Fi 6. There's been some complaints about the Starlink Mini being on Wi-Fi 5 when it could be on Wi-Fi 6, and how there's performance differences. In reality, there's a difference in the specifications of potential maximum speed between Wi-Fi 5 and Wi-Fi 6. But practically speaking, you're not really going to see a big difference because the bottleneck is the connection from the dish to the satellite. Now, if you're doing a lot of local transfers between devices on your local area network, then sure, Wi-Fi 6 is going to be a lot faster. But what you could also do is just wirelessly bridge your Starlink connection to a local router that supports Wi-Fi 6, and that'll let you transfer files between your local devices at Wi-Fi 6 speeds. But as far as the actual speed for Starlink, you're really not going to see any difference between Wi-Fi 5 and Wi-Fi 6. And if you're upgrading from Starlink Gen 2 to a Starlink mini dish, both of these are on Wi-Fi 5, so you're definitely not going to see a difference there. So there are some additional observations that I want to share with you with my experience this last month using the Starlink mini. This is purely anecdotal. When you have your dish turned on for the first time, you can go to the obstructions page and see whether or not your view of the sky is obstructed. As the satellite goes past the field of view of the dish, it'll basically draw like a jagged line across the obstructions view. And I don't know if it's just me or if it's actually the case, but it seems to me that the Starlink Mini is actually scanning for obstructions faster, which could also mean that it is scanning the sky at a different speed. But they have the same 110-degree field of view, so you would think that it isn't the case. But it is possible that the software within these two dishes are different in a sense where the Starlink Mini is using each satellite for a shorter period of time and switching to another one sooner. But these are just my anecdotal observations about the obstruction scanning. I have no real data to back that up besides what I've experienced. And obviously the Gen 3 dish that I've been using for this last week is extremely fast and likely much more reliable as well. In places where you have obstructions, in places where you have heavy rain, it is likely that a Gen 3 dish is going to perform better. And once again, the much lower power consumption rate for the Starlink Mini is the number one reason why I, and probably most of you, are looking forward to switching as well. I was constantly running into power deficits when I'm using the Gen 2 dish because it uses twice the amount of power that the Starlink Mini does. And ever since I've switched, even off the grid, I'm recharging up to 100% using 400 watts of solar panels without any problems at all. So that's been the number one best benefit for me to have switched over to the Starlink Mini. And the portability is also a cool bonus. The way that my Gen 2 dish is flat mounted on the roof, it's really difficult for me to unmount it and take it out and put it out in the field if I'm parked under trees or something like that. But the Starlink Mini has been really easy. Using the mounting option that I have on the roof, I can simply just unclick the dish and put it out into a field 50 feet away and still be able to use it. The only downside is that because the router is built into the dish itself, when I move the dish far away from the vehicle, it is possible that it can be too far away for the signal to be weak. Now, on the other hand, what I've experienced in the past is that with my Gen 2 dish, when it was mounted on the roof and the router inside the car, the opposite is the case. Sometimes when I'm outside of the car, the signal from the Wi-Fi is too weak. Versus now, the mini dish being on the roof, I always get good service when I'm inside the car, and I get also really good service when I'm outside of the car. I can be 20, 30, 40, 50 feet away and even further in some cases from the car and still get perfect Wi-Fi reception. So in conclusion, I would say the Starlink Mini, it is probably the most ideal dish for anybody who needs a portable satellite internet option for nomads that are living off the grid, and or if you're living in an area off the grid where power can be difficult to come by. Maybe it's very cloudy, maybe you're in the shaded area where you have minimal solar output. Being able to save 50% of power in the consumption of electricity in the Starlink Mini versus the Gen 2 has been a huge godsend for me. And especially now, with the $150 Black Friday discount, I think if you've been waiting to get a Starlink Mini dish, right now is the time to get it. I'm not sure it's going to get much cheaper than that in the US anytime soon. Maybe by this time next year, the Starlink Mini will be similarly priced in the US as it is in Latin America. Now, having used all three of these dishes now, the Gen 2 Actuated, the Starlink Mini, and also the Gen 3, I'm actually fairly impressed with the Gen 3 dish. I thought the Gen 3 dish was way too big and it would use too much power, but as a matter of fact, it doesn't use that much more power than the Gen 2, and I feel like if you have the power to do it, the benefits of the Gen 3 being that it's faster, it's more reliable, it has better Wi-Fi range, it has better local area network Wi-Fi speeds due to Wi-Fi 6, that is actually a pretty compelling reason to upgrade to the Gen 3 dish over the Mini. In the US, the Gen 3 dish is now the standard dish. You can get this dish even with the Black Friday discount on the Mini for $100 cheaper. Starlink also, the same time that they came out with the cigarette lighter plug for the Mini, they also came out with a DC power supply for the Gen 3 dish. So if you want to install this into your RV, you can actually do it now using a factory-made, factory-sold DC power supply. And being that it's the only dish that has a Wi-Fi 6 router, the actual Starlink speed and the local area network speed is a priority, and you have more power than you know what to do with, I would actually go with the Gen 3 dish right now. And personally, because power consumption is still a priority to me, I'm going to be sticking with the Starlink Mini. So there you go. That's my review of the Starlink Mini as it compares to the Gen 2 and the Gen 3 Starlink dishes. I hope this video has been helpful to you guys. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments below. If you want to take advantage of the Starlink Mini discount, as well as the availability of their DC power supplies, look for them in the links below. Thanks as always for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one.